Most people think they know Lionel Richie's story. A hitmaker who wrote the soundtrack to a generation's weddings and slow dances, now in his late 70s, dating a woman 40 years younger. It sounds like a familiar Hollywood headline. But the real story, the one Richie himself only recently chose to tell, is stranger, sadder, and far more human than the tabloid version. It involves a beach house he was hiding in decades before anyone knew his first marriage was already over, a medical mystery that nearly ended his singing career, and a health scare on a stage in Minnesota just last summer that reminded the world he is not, in fact, indestructible. For nearly 40 years, the story of June 1988 was reduced to a single ugly headline. Lionel Richie's first wife caught him with another woman, a fight broke out, and police were called. That was the entire narrative for decades, because Richie almost never spoke about it publicly. That changed in September 2025, when Richie published his memoir, Truly. In it, he finally explained what the headlines never captured. He and his first wife, Brenda Harvey-Richie, his college sweetheart at Tuskegee University, whom he married in 1975, were already living separately by that point, though almost no one outside their circle knew it. What very few people knew was that Brenda and I were separated, Richie wrote, according to excerpts published by Fox News and People. I got a place at the beach, and I was hiding out there, trying to be alone, trying to decompress somehow, because it was killing everyone. That single detail reframes everything. The public version of the story was a marriage destroyed in one reckless night. Richie's own account describes something slower and sadder, a relationship that had already quietly ended, and a man retreating to a beach house simply to catch his breath from the pressure of his own fame. Then, early one morning, Richie drove back into town and stopped to see Diane Alexander, a woman he had been seeing and would later marry, at her Beverly Hills apartment. Shortly after he arrived, there was a knock at the door. It was Brenda. It's the most awful screaming match of my life, and it's all in this small entryway, Richie wrote. The story became the scandal of my century. It took on a life of its own. The legal record confirms just how serious that night became. According to contemporaneous police reports cited by Fox News and UPI, officers arriving at the scene found Brenda Harvey striking and kicking Richie, with furniture in the apartment broken and scattered. Richie, identified in the police report as a second victim, told officers Brenda had kicked him in the stomach. She was arrested and later released on $5,000 bail. The couple's divorce was finalized in 1993. What Richie's memoir adds isn't a rewrite of that record. The police report stands as it stood. What it adds is context that simply wasn't available to the public in 1988, the sense that this wasn't a marriage shattered by a single decision, but one that had already been unraveling in private for some time before it became this scandal of the century, as he called it. He's also been careful not to use that context to erase anyone else's pain. In the memoir, he described Brenda as heartbroken after the confrontation, adding, "There's always a way to spin everything. Not this time. None of us had been in this situation." It's a rare thing for someone this famous to revisit their most humiliating public moment and complicate it rather than simplify it. But that turned out to be a pattern with Richie, a willingness, late in life, to admit that the years everyone assumed were his most triumphant were also the years he was quietly falling apart. If the 1988 headline was the public wound, the 1990s brought a private one, and this crisis attacked the one thing Richie's entire identity was built around, his voice. By his own account, this was the hardest stretch of his life. He was navigating the fallout of his divorce, caring for his father, Lionel Richie Sr., who would pass away in 1990, and dealing with a throat problem doctors could not explain. Something was wrong with his vocal cords, and no one could tell him what. Over roughly 4 years, Richie underwent 4 separate throat surgeries. Each one came with hope. None of them fixed the problem. Speaking to People for the magazine's Black History Month issue in 2022, Richie described just how close he came to breaking. "About as close as you ever would have come to a nervous breakdown," he said, recalling the period. "You don't want anybody fooling around down there. This is your identity. I never really thought that it would end." In an earlier interview with Piers Morgan, Richie put it even more starkly, describing the psychological toll of sitting in silence not knowing if he'd sing again. "I have been through 4 surgeries, vocal surgeries. And while you're sitting there in silence, the question comes up, who am I? Who am I really?" The eventual diagnosis, when it came, was almost anticlimactic given the years of fear that preceded it. A doctor who looked at his overall health rather than only his throat determined that Richie was suffering from diet-induced acid reflux, stomach acid reaching his throat, particularly at night, and inflaming the tissue around his vocal cords. Once that was identified, the fix wasn't another operation. It was managing his diet and habits. Richie recovered fully and, by his own account, has not struggled with the same issue since. It's worth sitting with how strange that outcome is. A world-class singer came within what he describes as a hair's breadth of a breakdown, endured 4 invasive surgeries, and the actual cause turned out to be something as ordinary as what he was eating before bed. It's a reminder that even for someone with access to the best specialists in the world, a health crisis rooted in stress and daily habits can be the hardest kind to diagnose, because doctors are often looking for something exotic when the real answer is close to home. There's a small human coda to this chapter that Richie has returned to more than once. During the depths of that uncertainty, he recalled meeting an older man on a beach in Jamaica who pulled him aside and told him, "You must survive because you are our beacon of hope. If you make it, we know we can make it." It's the kind of moment that doesn't change a medical outcome, but clearly stayed with him as a reason to keep going. By the time Richie met Lisa Parigi, roughly a decade ago, he had already lived through a defining scandal, 2 divorces. He married Diane Alexander in 1995, they divorced in 2004, and a medical scare that had shaken his sense of who he was without his voice. The relationship that followed didn't look like the ones the tabloids were used to writing about him. Parigi was born and raised in Switzerland, of Caribbean, Swiss, and Chinese descent, and is fluent in multiple languages, including German, French, Swiss German, and English. Before stepping into the public eye as Richie's partner, she worked in corporate technology in Switzerland, not the entertainment or fashion world most assumed. She later moved into modeling and, eventually, entrepreneurship, founding the Estate Collection, a lifestyle brand built around candles and fragrance, and Glow Up Beauty, a vegan skincare line. The two met, according to multiple accounts, including an interview Parigi gave to Harper's Bazaar Arabia, at a dinner party in Los Angeles that she attended while visiting from Switzerland, introduced by mutual friends. "We had great conversations. We spoke all night long about everything," she said of that first meeting. "It's been beautiful so far." The 40-year age gap between them has been, unsurprisingly, the thing most commentary has fixated on. But what tends to get lost in that fixation is that Parigi built her businesses independently. She has spoken about developing her own products, from a travel-friendly under-eye collagen mask to a full skincare line, and about her interests in art, NFTs, and investing, including a stake in a healthcare technology startup called Heal. Whatever else is true about the relationship, her public identity was not constructed around being Lionel Richie's girlfriend. It existed, and continues to exist, alongside it. What Richie has said publicly about her is notably consistent over the years, and notably unglamorous in its framing. In a 2019 interview with People, he didn't lead with anything about romance or spectacle. He led with something closer to relief. "She's extremely beautiful," Richie said, "but most importantly, she's smart and helps me deal with my crazy world." He went further. "At this time in my life when you can be so jaded about things, Lisa kind of makes everything feel a bit safe." That word, safe, is doing a lot of work. This is a man who, by his own account, spent his 30s and 40s navigating a public divorce scandal and a private medical crisis that made him question his own identity. Safe isn't the word most people reach for to describe a whirlwind late-in-life romance. It's the word someone uses when they've had enough chaos and finally found some stability. Richie made a similar point, even more plainly, at his 2022 induction into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Thanking the people closest to him on stage, he named his children and grandchildren, and then added simply, "Lisa, my heart." None of this, the memoir, the health history, the relationship, exists in a vacuum from what happened just over a month ago, in the summer of 2026, on a stage in Minnesota. On June 24, 2026, Richie opened his co-headlining Sing a Song All Night Long tour with Earth, Wind and Fire at the Grand Casino Arena in St. Paul. About 55 minutes into the show, in front of roughly 10,000 fans, Richie told the crowd he was feeling dizzy. He had just performed Dancing on the Ceiling, sitting down on a step on the stage, something, he told the audience, he had never done before. He sat again for 3 times a lady, then called for an unplanned intermission and left the stage. Not long after, saxophonist Dino Saldo returned to tell the crowd, "Unfortunately, Lionel is not feeling well. He won't be able to continue." According to Earth, Wind and Fire drummer John Paris, speaking to the Minnesota Star-Tribune, Richie had shown no signs of illness before the performance and later attributed the episode to feeling a little dehydrated. St. Paul Fire EMS confirmed that an individual was transported to a local hospital from the arena that night. 2 days later, Live Nation announced that Richie's next 2 shows, in Chicago and Columbus, would be postponed under advisement by doctors to rest and return to full health. The statement described Richie as heartbroken to postpone the dates. The tour resumed, as scheduled, in Pittsburgh on June 30th. It's easy, in hindsight, to treat a moment like that as simply a scare that passed, and by all public accounts it was. Richie was back on stage within days. But it's also a genuinely striking image. A 77-year-old man who has spent more than 5 decades as one of the most durable performers in popular music, sitting down mid-song in front of 10,000 people because his body needed him to. It's the kind of moment that tends to reorganize how people think about someone's story, not because it changes the facts of his career, but because it's a reminder that the story is still being lived, in real time, by a man in his late 70s who is still choosing to tour. Strip away the tabloid framing, and what's left is a fairly unusual through line for a celebrity biography, a man whose most public humiliation turned out to be the tail end of a marriage that had already quietly ended, whose greatest professional fear turned out to be traceable to something as mundane as his evening meals, and whose current relationship, whatever the public makes of the age gap, is one he has consistently described not in terms of glamour, but in terms of feeling steadier than he had in years. None of this erases the pain on any side of it. Not Brenda Harvey's, not Richie's own drawn-out medical ordeal, not the very real disruption of a health scare on a tour stage in 2026. Richie's memoir doesn't ask anyone to forget the legal record of that night in 1988, and it doesn't rewrite what 4 throat surgeries cost him physically and emotionally in the years that followed. What it does is fill in the parts of the story that were missing the first time around, parts that only Richie himself could actually tell. At 77, with a best-selling memoir behind him and a tour he's still determined to finish, Lionel Richie has spent the last year doing something that's rarer than it should be for people this famous, correcting his own record, in his own words, while he's still around to do it. Sources referenced: Fox News, People, Yahoo/Parade, News Nation, Primetimer, TV Insider, Hello Magazine, TMZ, Bring Me the News, Music Times, Jambase, Harper's Bazaar Arabia, and Richie's 2025 memoir, Truly, Harper 1.